Herb will be teaching our class this morning for us. That's okay. If you'd like to go ahead and open to Luke and chapter 20. That'll be our main text for this morning. It is the Tuesday of the week of Jesus' crucifixion. And we find him in the temple and teaching as he always did. And we notice back in chapter 19 and verse 48 that they were anxious to hear what he said. It says, Luke records, for all the people were hanging on his words. But as Jesus taught, he was interrupted by a group of the Jewish leaders. They had come to challenge him, to discredit him, to disprove him. And they were going to do so by challenging his authority. Where did this authority, what did it rest upon? Was it the teaching of the scribes? Was it on the scriptures? What was the source from which he got his authority? And then on top of that, who gave him authority to teach these things? Now remember, it's not only what Jesus taught, but also what he did. The day before is when he had cleansed the temple of those who had sought to, devalue it by their own greed. They weren't looking for a true answer to their question. See, they knew the answer. The only authority was going to come from them, and they had given Jesus no such authority. And so not only did they interrupt him, they're trying to disprove him in what he has to say. Now let us understand that as his death drew near, these opportunities to teach about himself and the kingdom were becoming fewer and more precious to him. And to be interrupted by those who wanted to undermine his words was just unacceptable. So Jesus silences them quickly and with a question that they dare not answer. He then turns his attention back to the crowd who had heard all these things. This challenge was voiced at a volume to which it would carry throughout the crowd. That was their intent. So Jesus now turns to the crowd who had heard this, and he begins a parable. And it is a parable that is both about him and about those who had dared to interrupt him. Now, such an interruption, when you're in the middle of teaching something, when there's a train of thought that is moving, when there is an argument that is being made, to have that utterly and completely interrupted, and then the authority by which you were teaching challenged, this would have flustered probably the best orators among us. And yet Jesus does not even pause, but in the moment prepares a parable grounded in Scripture that not only allows him to continue what he had been teaching before these men arrived, but also included them in the parable, exposing them and their sinful motives to the crowds. Let's look in chapter 20 of Luke and beginning in verse 9. And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went to another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And so he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Jesus draws this parable from the idea found in chapter 5 of Isaiah, where Isaiah talks about the vineyard, and the vineyard being the nation of Israel. And as you work through chapter 5, in the first few verses, one of the things that you notice is that God has been very careful with his people. God says that he chose fertile ground for his vineyard, and he carefully prepared the soil for them. He goes on to say that he had planted choice vines and cared for them and watched over them and protected them. In verse 4, God even goes on to challenge Israel by saying, "What more was there to do for my vineyard? What have I not done in it?" God had done everything that was necessary for his vineyard to prosper and to return to him the fruit for which they had been planted. And yet, in verse 7, we read, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, an outcry." Through the parable, Jesus shares with the crowd how their forefathers had rejected those who had been sent to them by God. Not only rejected, mistreated, and had beaten them. But now when the owner of the vineyard sends his only son, he's letting the crowd know that these men who stand before you, my accusers, will not only reject him, but cast him out and put him to death. This parable brings about a couple different reactions from those who heard it. The crowd who had gathered to hear Jesus, who had been hanging on his every word, continued to do so. And with such a zeal as to deter the leaders from killing Jesus at that very moment. Verse 19 of chapter 20. The other reaction is from those at whom the parable was directed. The scribes and the chief priest recognized that the parable was about them and reacted with a murderous rage, restrained only by their fear of the people and what they would do. Now, if we were to continue in the narrative that Luke gives us, we would see that he moves on from this confrontation to record the other events of the day. For much of what happened on this Tuesday, he records, and there was a lot that went on, and there was much to tell. But for our purposes this morning, let's pause here for a few moments and think about what Jesus has said about himself near the end of this parable. Beginning in verse 13, let's look. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Jesus says to the crowd through this parable, "I am about to die. And it will be a violent death, and at the hands of those who can even now barely restrain themselves." To speak of your own obituary, to even consider your own death, which is only days away. Imagine how difficult it would be to utter these words that we see in the parable. For Jesus to know how literal this parable would prove to be. You know, Jesus was always surrounded by someone. Were it his disciples, were it the crowds, it seemed like there was always someone near him. And yet he was so often alone. Here in the temple at the Passover, it's estimated that there's probably up to 3 million Jews who had come to Jerusalem for this Passover. And yet how utterly alone Jesus was in this moment, knowing that only he fully understood the parable that he had spoken. And I want us to remember the strength and the love that was required for Jesus, not only to speak of his death, but to then continue to do the very things that would ensure it. Now, we've noticed that those who heard the parable either marveled or responded with rage and with fear. But I want us to notice as well that no one approached Jesus and asked him about his death to comfort him or show any concern. No one in the crowd wept when they heard Jesus speak these words about himself. No one stepped into the breach and said, I will not allow it. And eventually, those who had challenged Jesus departed to plot some other way by which they might catch him up in his words and find him guilty of a charge worthy of death. The crowd seemed to have remained with him or was replaced by others, for we see them in the next instance where Jesus is confronted by the leaders of the Jews. As for Jesus, he had considered the cross and the sacrifice that it required, and continued, as he had all his life, to move steadily towards it.